The dust on the horizon was a common sight, but the lone stagecoach was not. Caleb Thorne stood on the porch of his half-rotting homestead, the Arizona sun beating down on his weathered face. His ranch, the only thing he had left of his father, was a ghost of its former self. The cattle were thin, the fences were broken, and the land was as parched as his soul. Caleb was a man of few words and even fewer friends, a stubborn rock in a river of hardship. He'd come to accept his solitude, seeing it not as a curse, but as a shield. The town of redemption was a 2-day ride, and the last thing he expected was a visitor, let alone one delivered by the stage. A cloud of cynicism hung over him as he watched the carriage slow, the driver tipping his hat with a grin that felt too wide to be sincere. A woman stepped out, a small trunk clutched in her hand. Her dress, though neat, was caked with travel dust. She looked weary, but there was a quiet dignity in her posture. The driver gestured toward Caleb with a chuckle. "Your package, Mr. Thorne. Straight from the east, as requested." Caleb's frown deepened. He hadn't requested anything. He strode down the steps, his boots thudding on the cracked wood, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol at his hip. "You've made a mistake, driver. I don't know this woman." The driver's grin widened. "Don't you? Heard a fella in town say you were looking for a bride. A fine catch, too. Told her you were the richest man for 100 miles. A little joke amongst friends." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. The prank, a cruel, vicious jab from the townsman who resented his aloofness and his father's old money. He was a target, and this woman was the unfortunate payload. He turned to her, a cold fire in his eyes. "You came all this way because of a lie?" She met his gaze without flinching, her expression a mix of shame and exhaustion. "The letter said you needed a partner, a decent man. It offered a home." Her voice was soft but firm. "It didn't mention it was a joke." The driver, having delivered his cruel punchline, was already climbing back onto his perch, the laughter echoing in the sudden silence of the desert. "Good luck, you two!" he called out, before snapping the reins and disappearing in a new cloud of dust. Caleb and the woman were left alone, two strangers bound by a shared humiliation. The sun dipped lower, casting long, stark shadows across the barren landscape. The heat of the day gave way to the sharp bite of the desert evening. He finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "I don't need a wife, and I sure as hell don't need a joke from those fools." He turned and walked back toward his house, leaving her standing alone, her small trunk at her feet, a testament to a hope that had just been cruelly extinguished. Eleanor Vance stood as the dust of the stagecoach settled, the silence of the Arizona desert swallowing the driver's cruel laughter. Her heart ached with a familiar pang of humiliation. This was not her first disappointment, but it was perhaps the most brutal. She had lost her husband, her home, and now her last shred of hope. She watched the man, Caleb Thorne, disappear into his dilapidated house. The door slammed shut with a finality that felt like a sentence. The evening chill began to seep into her thin traveling clothes. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no money for a return fare. She was a burden, a punchline. She sank onto her trunk, burying her face in her hands, a single silent tear tracking a path through the grime on her cheek. An hour passed, then 2. The stars began to prick the inky sky, and the silence was broken only by the mournful howl of a coyote. She was on the verge of standing to brave the night when the front door creaked open again. Caleb emerged, a lantern in his hand. Its light cut a soft yellow square in the darkness. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, the light illuminating the grim set of his jaw. "You can't stay out here," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't an invitation, more a statement of fact. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I'm not asking for your charity, Mr. Thorne." "Good," he grunted, "because I don't have any to give." He gestured toward the porch. "There's a cot in the guest room. You can stay for a night, that's all. In the morning, you'll need to figure out your own way back." He didn't wait for her to respond, simply turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open for her to follow. The interior was as desolate as the outside. A thick layer of dust covered everything. The air was heavy with the smell of old smoke and disuse. She found the cot in a small, windowless room, the mattress lumpy and the blankets thin. As she lay down, wrapped in the cold of the room and the cold of the man who owned it, she felt a profound sense of loneliness. But beneath it, a spark of resolve began to glow. She had been a joke, a victim. She wouldn't be either for much longer. The night was a long one, filled with the strange sounds of the desert and the restless turnings of a tired mind. But as the sun rose, casting a fiery orange light across the sky, she rose with it, her mind made up. She wouldn't be going anywhere. Not yet. Caleb woke with the sun, the familiar weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He went to the kitchen expecting it to be cold and empty, but the faint aroma of coffee was a foreign intrusion. The woman was already up. Eleanor stood by the stove, a kettle whistling, her back to him. She had a no-nonsense air about her, her movements precise and efficient. He grunted, pouring himself a cup of the steaming black liquid she offered. It was hot and strong, a small but welcome change from the weak, often lukewarm brew he was used to. He watched her for a moment, an odd curiosity stirring within him. She wasn't an ideal mail-order bride. She wasn't young or beautiful in the way a man might expect, but there was a quiet strength in her plain features. "I'm not leaving," she said, without turning around. Her voice was steady, leaving no room for argument. "I have no money, and I have nowhere to go. I can earn my keep. My husband was a carpenter. I can fix things. I can cook. I can clean. I'm not a charity case." Caleb bristled. "I told you I don't need a wife. And I sure as hell don't need a handout." "I'm not offering myself as a wife," she said, finally turning to face him. "I'm offering myself as a solution. This place is falling apart. You're trying to do it all yourself, and you're failing. I can help. I can work. And in return I'll have a roof over my head, no more, no less." Her words were a direct assault on his pride. He was a thorn, a man who needed no one. But as he looked around the kitchen, at the layer of dust, the grimy windows, the broken chair in the corner, he had to admit she was right. His stubborn pride warred with a grim, undeniable truth. He was drowning. "A week," he said gruffly. "You work for a week. We'll see how you do." Eleanor didn't smile or show any sign of triumph. She simply nodded. The first task she took on was the broken fence out by the south pasture. He'd been putting it off for months, a job too big for one man and too expensive to hire out. He rode out later that day to find her, not just watching, but actively working. She had an old shovel and a hammer, and she was mending the fence with a surprising amount of skill and a grim determination. She didn't look up, didn't ask for help. She was just doing it. He watched for a long time, the sun hot on his neck, an unfamiliar feeling washing over him. It wasn't affection or desire. It was something else, a flicker of respect. The week turned into a month, and the transformation of the Thorne homestead was subtle but profound. Eleanor worked from sunup to sundown, a quiet force of nature. She didn't seek his praise or his company. She simply worked. She mended the torn leather of his saddles, she fixed a broken latch on the barn door, and she tended to a sick calf with a gentle touch Caleb hadn't seen in years. The house, which had been a dusty monument to neglect, began to feel different. There was no grand cleaning, no extravagant redecoration. It was the little things, the scent of fresh-baked bread that filled the air in the mornings, the sight of mended shirts neatly folded, a vase of wildflowers on the table. One evening, after a long day of work, Caleb came inside to find Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, a book in her hands. The lamp cast a soft glow on her face, and for the first time he noticed she wasn't just a workhorse. She was a woman with her own quiet world. "You read?" he asked, his voice rough. She looked up, startled. "When I have a moment." She closed the book. "It's a small luxury." They fell into a comfortable silence, something that had been unthinkable just a month ago. He ate the stew she'd made, the flavor rich and deep, a far cry from the tasteless beans and tough jerky he'd been subsisting on. "You've done good work," he finally said, the words feeling clumsy and foreign on his tongue. Eleanor simply nodded, a small, grateful smile touching the corners of her lips. "It's a fair trade, Mr. Thorne." "Caleb," he corrected her, the word escaping him before he could think. She looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met across the table, the lamplight illuminating something unspoken between them. The air was no longer cold and empty. It was filled with a fragile warmth, a sense of shared space. The house was no longer just a place to sleep, it was beginning to feel like a home. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization for a man who had sworn off all human connection. The tension on the ranch was not of anger, but of an unspoken awareness. The small moments began to build, brick by brick, a fragile bridge between them. One afternoon, a fierce dust storm rolled in, turning the sky a sickly yellow-brown. Caleb had been working on a fence line far from the house and had a hard time making it back. He stumbled in, covered in a thick layer of grit, his skin raw. Eleanor was waiting for him with a bucket of warm water and a clean towel. Without a word, she began to clean the dust from his face and hands, her touch light and careful. He stood there, silent, allowing her. Her hands were calloused from hard work, but they were gentle. It was the first time in years anyone had touched him with care. The physical contact was an electric shock, a jolt to his isolated world. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the tired widow, but a resilient woman, her eyes full of quiet compassion. He had seen her strength in action. Now he saw her heart. The storm raged outside, but inside, a new kind of calm settled between them. Later that night they sat on the porch, watching the last of the storm clouds roll away, the stars brilliant and sharp in the newly washed sky. "Tell me about your husband," Caleb said, the question feeling heavy and monumental. Eleanor sighed softly. "He was a good man, a kind man. He taught me a lot. We didn't have much, but we had each other." The simple words carried the weight of a life lived and lost. Caleb, in turn, found himself speaking of his father, of the hopes he had for the ranch, of the way the land had slowly, stubbornly defeated him. They weren't just two people sharing a space. They were two broken souls, sharing their histories, finding solace in the quiet understanding. He took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. Her fingers were slender and a little rough. The fire that had been smoldering between them wasn't one of passion, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet, steady flame of companionship and shared grief, a flicker of hope that had been born from the ashes of a cruel joke. And for the first time, Caleb didn't feel alone. He felt a different kind of fire, one that warmed him from the inside out. The town of Redemption had a short memory for good deeds, but a long one for scandal. News travelled on the wind, carried by passing riders and travelling merchants. The story of Caleb Thorne's mail-order bride and the prank that had been played on him was already a favourite tale in the saloon. The laughter was loud, fueled by whiskey and a general dislike for the Thorne name. But when it was reported that the woman, the old widow, was still at the ranch, a strange silence fell over the room. The architect of the prank, a man named Silas, was a rival rancher, a venomous man who held a long-standing grudge against the Thorne family. He had a cruel smile that never reached his eyes. "She's still there?" he spat, slamming his whiskey glass on the table. He must be desperate, a thorned man, fallen for a tired old thing like that. His words, meant to be a simple sneer, took on a new, more sinister tone. The prank hadn't worked. He had made a fool of himself, and now it was his turn to be the laughingstock. He began to spread a different kind of rumor, one full of spite. He spoke of Eleanor as a gold digger, a woman who had tricked Caleb into letting her stay. He whispered that she was a witch, a conniving serpent who had bewitched the stubborn Thorne man. The whispers were meant to shame Caleb, to turn the town against him, and the woman who had brought an unwanted happiness into his life. The next time Caleb rode into town for supplies, the familiar jeers had been replaced by a quiet, hostile silence. Men turned away from him in the general store. A woman pulled her child closer as he passed. The atmosphere was thick with judgment. He felt the weight of it, the way he felt the heat of the midday sun. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel shame or anger. He felt a fierce, protective instinct. He saw the eyes of Silas in the corner, a smirk on his face. He knew who was behind the rumors. He knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to poison the fragile new world he and Eleanor had built, and he wouldn't let them. He bought his supplies, his shoulders squared, his gaze firm. He wasn't a thorn who was a victim anymore. He was a thorn who had something to protect. And for a man who had been isolated for so long, the feeling was both a terrifying and liberating weight. The day Caleb returned from town, a grim look on his face, Eleanor knew something was wrong. The silence he carried was heavier than usual. She waited until after dinner, until the lamplight cast a warm, safe circle around them. "What happened in town?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb sighed, a long, weary sound. He told her about the rumors, about Silas's cruel whispers, about the town's coldness. He expected her to be hurt, to feel shamed, to want to leave, but instead she sat in quiet contemplation. "They're just words, Caleb," she said finally, her voice firm. "They don't know us. They don't know the truth." "It's more than that," he said, his voice low with frustration. "He's trying to ruin us, to drive you away. And I won't let him." The next morning, Caleb did something he had never done before. He put on his best suit, a dark, starched thing that felt foreign on his skin, and rode back into town, not for supplies, but for a confrontation. He walked straight to the saloon, where he knew the men would be gathered. Silas was there, leaning against the bar, a sneer already on his face. Caleb didn't pull a gun. He didn't throw a punch. He walked to the center of the room and stood there, a solitary pillar of defiance. "I hear you boys have a new game," he said, his voice carrying through the sudden hush of the room. "Spreading lies about a good woman, the old widow you call her." His eyes found Silas's. "You sent her as a joke. You thought she was a joke, but you were wrong." He paused, his gaze sweeping over every man in the room. "That woman, Eleanor Vance, she is more a man than any of you will ever be. She came here with nothing but her dignity, and she has worked harder than all of you put together. She took a broken home and made it whole. She took a broken man and gave him a reason to fight." The air was thick with tension. Silas's face had gone from a sneer to a furious red. "You're a fool, Thorn," he hissed. "You've been tricked." Caleb took a step closer to him. "The only fool here is the man who thinks he can tear down something real with a cheap lie. The only man who is truly alone is the one who has nothing but cruelty to offer." He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. As he rode out of town, he felt a new kind of power. He had stood up not for himself, but for the woman who had given him a reason to live. The confrontation hadn't been about winning a fight. It was about claiming his life back. It was about making a declaration of a different kind of love. Silas's pride, wounded by Caleb's public humiliation, turned to a cold, venomous rage. Words weren't enough. He had to prove his dominance, to show the town that Caleb's newfound dignity was a lie, a weakness he could exploit. A few nights later, under the cover of darkness, Silas and his men rode out to the Thorn Ranch. They didn't come to steal or to fight face to face. They came to destroy. They tore down a long section of fence along the main pasture, leaving a gaping hole for the cattle to wander into the open desert. They rode on, their final act a slash of a knife to the water trough, leaving the precious resource to drain into the thirsty soil. The next morning Caleb discovered the damage. His heart sank, but a cold, focused anger took its place. He knew who was responsible. Eleanor stood beside him, her face pale. "They're trying to break us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb shook his head. "They're trying to prove a point, and they're fools if they think this will be the end of it." He rode out to gather the scattered cattle, a grim determination in his eyes. Eleanor, in turn, began the impossible task of patching the water trough, her hands raw and bleeding from the effort. Help came from the most unexpected of places. A quiet neighbor, a man named Jesse, who had been a silent observer of the events in town, rode over with a team of his own men and a wagon full of fencing supplies. "I heard what happened, Caleb," he said, his eyes steady and kind. "That was a coward's move. This town doesn't need that kind of poison." With the extra hands, the work that would have taken Caleb weeks was done in a day. As they worked, the men talked, their respect for Caleb growing with every post they set, with every word of praise for Eleanor's quiet resilience. They saw a man who was fighting for more than just his land. He was fighting for his life and for the woman who had given it back to him. That night, as the last of the fences were repaired and the cattle were safe, Caleb and Eleanor sat on the porch, watching the stars. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, a weary, comfortable closeness. They were bruised, but not broken. The attack had been a test, and with the help of a kind neighbor, they had passed it, together. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Caleb knew they wouldn't have to face it alone. The next day, Caleb and Jesse rode into town together. The atmosphere was different now. The whispers were no longer about Caleb's folly, but about Silas's cruelty. The town's quiet disapproval had turned to open condemnation. Caleb and Jesse walked into the saloon, their presence commanding. Silas was already there, holding court with his men, their confidence shattered, their bravado gone. Caleb stood before him, the anger cold and hard in his eyes. "You think you're a man, Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You sneak onto a man's land in the dark and do the work of a vandal. You hurt a man's livelihood because you couldn't stand to see him happy. That's not the mark of a man. That's the mark of a boy who's never learned to take a loss." Silas's face contorted with rage, but he didn't lunge. He was a coward, and Caleb knew it. He wouldn't fight fair, not in front of everyone. "You're a liar, Thorn," Silas spat, his voice trembling with fury, "and that woman of yours is a witch." Caleb's voice remained calm, but it held the weight of a final judgment. "She's not a witch. She's just a decent woman who saw a broken ranch and a broken man and decided to fix them. And you, Silas, are so broken you can't stand to see anything made whole again. That's your shame, not hers, not mine." The words hung in the air, a final, undeniable truth. The men in the saloon, even Silas's own, looked away, embarrassed by his cowardice. Silas was defeated, not by a fist or a bullet, but by the quiet power of a man who had finally found his courage and his honor. With a final, furious glare, Silas pushed past Caleb and stormed out of the saloon. The silence was broken by Jesse, who clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "He's done, Caleb! He's finished!" Caleb nodded, the tension finally leaving his body. The fight was over. He had won, not by force, but by a simple declaration of truth. He had stood for his woman, for his home, and for a different kind of manhood. The final months of the year brought a new kind of peace to the Thorn Ranch. The land, once neglected, began to show signs of life under the combined efforts of Caleb and Eleanor. The cattle, well fed and cared for, were a testament to their hard work. The house, once a dark and lonely place, was now filled with the light of the fire and the quiet comfort of two people who had found each other. They had become a team, their love a slow-burning ember that had been forged in the crucible of a cruel joke and a vicious conflict. It wasn't the fiery, passionate love of a young couple, but something deeper, something more resilient. One evening, they sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, the gesture feeling as natural as breathing. "I never thought I'd find this," she said softly. her voice filled with a quiet contentment. A home. A partner. I thought I was alone. You're not alone, he said, his voice a low rumble. We're not. They sent you here as a joke, Eleanor, but they didn't know you. They didn't know what you would do. You didn't just mend this ranch. You fixed me. You set my nights on fire, and you gave me a reason to get up in the morning. He turned, his gaze soft and full of a love he had never thought he would feel. You're my home, Eleanor. She looked up at him, a tear rolling down her cheek, but it was a tear of joy. The joke had been on them. They had thought they could tear down two people with a vicious lie, but all they had done was bring them together. Their story was not one of revenge or bitterness, but of resilience, of finding a new beginning in the most unexpected of places. The sun sank below the horizon, and the first star of the evening began to twinkle in the darkening sky, a small, bright promise of all the nights to come. They sat there for a long time, two people who had been alone for so long, finally together, their hands intertwined, a testament to the power of a quiet love in a loud and unforgiving world. The Thorn Ranch was no longer a monument to a fading legacy. It was the foundation of a new one, built on the strength of a love that had been born from the ashes of a cruel joke.